Château de Pierrefonds, Northern France. Winter 1392. The castle's underground chambers held secrets that would not be discovered for centuries. Deep beneath the Great Hall, carved into bedrock and accessible only through narrow stone stairs that descended into darkness, lay a series of prison cells designed not for temporary detention, but for permanent removal of inconvenient people from the world above. These were not the romantic oubliettes of 19th century Gothic novels, bottle-shaped pits, accessed only through ceiling trapdoors, where bodies accumulated like discarded refuse. That image, popularized by writers like Victor Hugo and the architect Viollet-le-Duc, who reconstructed Pierrefonds in the 1800s, was largely literary invention that exaggerated genuine medieval practices into sensationalized horror. But the truth was disturbing enough without embellishment. Medieval castles across Europe contained underground prison chambers called cachots in French, verlies in German, where prisoners could be held indefinitely in conditions designed to break them physically and psychologically. Some of these chambers were accessed through vertical shafts requiring ladders or ropes that could be removed, leaving prisoners trapped below. Others were simply deep underground rooms with heavy doors and minimal ventilation, where cold, darkness, and isolation did the work of torture without requiring executioners or elaborate devices. The French word oublier, meaning to forget, does appear in medieval documents describing certain types of imprisonment, but it referred to the practice of forgetting prisoners existed rather than to a specific architectural feature. The winter of 1392 was particularly brutal across northern France. Philip II of Burgundy's court at nearby Dijon had just concluded a series of political purges following his consolidation of power after the death of Louis II of Flanders. Among those who disappeared during this period were several minor nobles and their family members who had backed losing factions in the succession disputes that plagued French nobility. Medieval chronicles from this period frequently mention political rivals who were imprisoned and heard from no more, a euphemistic phrase that could mean execution, exile, or indefinite imprisonment in conditions that amounted to slow death. What made underground imprisonment particularly devastating was not just the physical conditions, but the legal framework that enabled it. Medieval law distinguished sharply between different classes of prisoners, those held pending trial, those imprisoned as punishment for crimes, and those detained at the pleasure of their lord without formal charges. This third category, imprisonment by lordly prerogative, had no legal time limits, no required conditions of confinement, and no appeal process. A noble with sufficient power could order someone imprisoned indefinitely, and as long as he maintained control of the territory where the prison was located. That imprisonment could last until death. Women faced particular vulnerability within this system. Medieval marriage law gave husbands extensive control over wives' freedom of movement, property, and legal status, while outright murder of a wife would trigger family vendettas and church investigation. Imprisonment could be justified under the legal fiction that the husband was protecting his household's honor or managing a wife who had become mad or possessed. Chronicles and legal records from across medieval Europe document cases where wives disappeared into family castles, sometimes for years, without outside intervention. The most famous verified case is Marjorie de la Pole, imprisoned by her husband John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey. In the 1,290 seconds, She survived approximately 7 years in Conisbrough Castle's dungeons before being released following papal intervention, but only because her family had sufficient political connections to pressure church authorities to investigate. The physical design of medieval prison chambers reflected their purpose. In castles like Warwick in England, Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, and dozens of fortresses across the Holy Roman Empire, deep stone chambers were excavated during initial construction, specifically to serve as secure detention facilities. These weren't afterthoughts or converted storage rooms. They were purpose-built components of castle architecture that reveal how central imprisonment was to medieval systems of power. The chambers typically measured 8 to 12 feet square, with stone floors, walls, and ceilings. Heights varied from 4 to 7 feet, forcing taller prisoners into permanent stooping positions that caused spinal damage over time. Access to these chambers came through several configurations: heavy wooden doors at the end of descending stone stairs. Most common, vertical shafts requiring ladders that could be removed, or, in rare cases, hatches in floors through which prisoners could be lowered by rope. The Gothic myth of the pure oubliette, accessed only through ceiling trapdoors with no other entrance, has never been conclusively documented in a genuine medieval structure. Though 19th century restorers like Viollet-le-Duc created such features in their reconstructions based on their romantic understanding of medieval architecture. However, vertical access shafts with removable ladders definitely existed and served similar purposes once the ladder was withdrawn. Escape became impossible without outside assistance. The conditions within these underground chambers were systematically brutal. No windows meant complete darkness, except during the brief moments when guards brought food or removed waste. The absence of natural light caused prisoners to lose all sense of time, days blurred together, making it impossible to track how long imprisonment had lasted or how much life remained. Stone walls and floors maintained temperatures barely above freezing during winter months, while summer brought suffocating heat trapped by poor ventilation. Dampness was constant in below-ground chambers, causing respiratory infections, joint problems, and skin conditions that weakened prisoners progressively. Food provision varied by the prisoner's status and their captors' intentions. Some prisoners received adequate nutrition. Imprisonment was meant to confine them, not necessarily kill them quickly. Others received deliberately insufficient food that caused slow starvation over months. Water was usually provided, though its quality was suspect and dysentery was common. The most sadistic variation involved periods of adequate feeding, alternating with periods of near starvation, a psychological torture that gave hope before crushing it repeatedly. Waste removal was similarly variable. Some chambers had crude drainage systems or pits, while others simply accumulated refuse until the smell became unbearable even to guards, at which point minimal cleaning occurred. The psychological dimension of underground imprisonment was as devastating as the physical conditions. Medieval prisoners understood that their confinement had no necessary endpoint. They could be held for weeks, months, years, or until death, depending entirely on the whim of whoever controlled their imprisonment. This uncertainty prevented the psychological adaptation that might occur with a known sentence. Hope and despair alternated endlessly, each equally torturous. Prisoners strained to hear sounds from above that might indicate their fate. Footsteps approaching could mean food. Interrogation, our release, or execution. The inability to distinguish between these possibilities created constant anticipatory anxiety. Isolation compounded the darkness and cold. Human beings require social contact to maintain psychological stability. and prolonged solitary confinement causes measurable cognitive damage that modern research has documented extensively. Medieval jailers understood this empirically. Chronicles describe prisoners who emerged from long underground confinement unable to speak coherently, having lost language skills through years without conversation. Others developed what we would now recognize as severe depression or psychosis, conditions medieval observers described as demonic possession or divine punishment. The absence of time markers meant circadian rhythms collapsed, causing sleep disruption that further accelerated mental deterioration. Some prisoners maintained sanity through deliberate mental discipline, reciting prayers, composing poetry in their minds, solving mathematical problems, or carving marks into stone walls to track passing days. Archaeological excavations of medieval prison chambers have found these scratch marks, desperate attempts to impose order on chaos and maintain identity in conditions designed to erase it. The carvings sometimes include names, dates, prayers, or pleas for mercy directed at God, since no human audience would see them. Other prisoners carved images, crosses, family crests, or simple human figures that affirmed their continued existence as thinking, feeling beings despite their captors' efforts to reduce them to forgotten objects. Documented cases reveal the system's operation across medieval Europe. In England, the Tower of London's dungeons held numerous prisoners who languished for years without trial. The case of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, Welsh prince, imprisoned by Henry III in 1241, is well documented. He spent 11 years in the tower before dying in an escape attempt in 1244, falling from a rope made of sheets and linens that broke during his descent. The chronicler Matthew Paris recorded that Gruffydd had been confined in conditions so harsh that his health had deteriorated severely. Though he received periodic visits from family members who bribed guards for access, a privilege available only to prisoners, whose families remained powerful and wealthy enough to maintain such connections.